She was the third beer, not the first one, which the throat receives with almost tearful gratitude, nor the second that confirms and extends the pleasure of the first, but the third, the one you drink because it's there, because it can't hurt, and because what difference does it make? This, from her novel Song of Solomon, is the writing of Toni Morrison. Morrison once said that what drove her to write was the silence of so many stories untold and unexamined. A writer of singular vision and towering ambition, Morrison chronicled the African-American experience through works like Beloved, Jazz and Song of Solomon. This Nobel Prize-winning author is the subject of today's Great Lives, chosen by Andy Oliver. And Andy, you're a chef, broadcaster, restaurateur, judge on the Great British Menu. Is there a connection between food and literature?
Absolutely. I think I probably started daydreaming about things I could create in a kitchen when I was quite young and was reading, and food features so heavily in so many books, especially like young people's books. The escapism of the novel and the escapism of creativity in the kitchen, they sort of mirror each other. If you're cooking in the kitchen for other people, especially professionally, then you need to find your own creative voice. And to me, the things mirror each other quite obviously, but it might not be as obvious for other people, but it certainly is for me.
Your hero was born in 1931 and died only last August.
Yeah.
When did you first discover her writing?
I think I was around about 19 and I read her first book, actually, which is called The Bluest Eye. And as a child, books saved my life, is what helped me sustain my internal emotional life as a child. But I never read any books that had any black girls in them. We just weren't in books. We were never centred. We were never featured in anything. And then when I was about 19 or 20, I picked up a copy of The Bluest Eye, and the central character, Pecola Breedlove, is this young black girl who is in pain and is lost. In the book, she yearns for these blue eyes that are on a sweetie wrapper. There's a little blonde girl on a sweetie wrapper, and she feels like if only she had blue eyes like the little girl on the sweetie wrapper, maybe the world would be less cruel to her. I grew up in Suffolk in the 70s, you know, there weren't any other black girls around. And I daydreamed about having sort of long blonde hair and being a sort of little blonde girl because I thought that the world would treat me very, very differently. So when I picked up this book and I read about Pecola Breedlove, I was absolutely knocked sideways because it was like Toni Morrison had reached across the ocean into my heart and heard me.
A moment ago I heard you say books saved my life.
Yeah.
That's a bold statement.
It's a really true statement because I wasn't very happy. And so books gave me escape. Books reminded me that I wasn't always going to be stuck in a bedroom in Bury St Edmunds, upset and freaked out about what happened at school that day.
Were you bullied at school?
Yes, I was bullied at school in a sort of, it's that kind of casual 1970s racism, you know, it was that kind of everyday grind you down, corrosive racism where people would just make nasty little comments every day. And there was an incident that always sticks in my head where I got my mother to plait my hair. And I was a bit nervous about going to school with a new hairdo. Kids always are, you know. And I had little silver
Those
beads.
little fine plaits.
Yeah, little tiny
plaits,
plaits, cane rows. And I thought I looked lovely. Yeah. And I got to school and I walked into my German lesson and the German teacher, the adult male German teacher, got me to stand at the front of the class and got the class to humiliate me, basically, in German. That was the first 20 minutes of the class. Yeah. So, yeah, I was bullied at school by teachers as well as by other kids, but it also made me... I wasn't languishing by the side of the road. And I used to fight verbally and physically as well. Sometimes people were always wanting to fight you because you were the different person. You know, that's what happens if you're the different person. So, you know, I kind of went through all sorts of different responses to being bullied in that way, you know.
Toni Morrison's inspiration for The Bluest Eye came from a vivid memory from her own school days and a conversation she'd had with a friend. And here she is talking about that moment in her words.
I think we were 10 or 11. She was a close friend, and we were quarreling about the existence of God. And I was very certain that there was a God, and she was very certain that there was not. And then she stopped the conversation and the argument by saying she had proof of his non-existence. And I said, what is it? And she said, I have been praying for 2 years for blue eyes. And obviously he has not delivered. It was a real epiphany, because I looked at her and thought, this would be awful if God had given her blue eyes. She's very dark. She had these wonderful almond eyes, high cheekbones, you could go on. And she wanted something other.
Was there a moment when you stopped wanting something other? Andy? Yeah.
I'm not sure that it was a moment. I think it's been a gradual claiming of self. You know, you find your feet, your way to stand and own your piece of the earth, a way to occupy space. And I guess different people find different routes to that end. And for me, it's been through literature, it's been through books, because there's a certain intimacy to reading, you know.
Yes.
When you find a writer, like when I read Toni Morrison, like that first quote that you read about being the third beer, just the specificity of her language, the way she drops, there's a rhythm to it, there's musicality to it, you know. And I come from a musical background. I was started as a singer, you know, so there's a rhythm and a lilt and a kind of roll to the way that she writes that has always just sat in my bones in a way that helps me feel sturdy.
Like the central figure in The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison grew up in the steel mill town of Lorain. Is it pronounced Lorain?
Lorain, yes, I believe
Lorain,
so.
Ohio, in the 1930s. Back then, she was called Chloe Wofford. Do you know much about her upbringing?
I know that she didn't really start thinking about racism and separatism in that kind of way until she was a bit older. But I think the school that she went to initially, she was the only black girl there,
Yeah.
Interestingly. But for her, that wasn't a traumatic experience. It was only later on that she realised that there were all these social divisions.
Her family, as you'll know, were a working class black family in a time of severe economic hardship. She was descended from slaves from Alabama. Her parents both grew up in the South, but they moved to Lorain, a racially integrated town, to escape debt and violence. Reading when young must have meant an awful lot to her then, and here she is talking about what it meant to her own forebears.
My grandparents, they were Southerners. They were sharecroppers. They were unschooled, and they couldn't read. They were in a world where it was against the law to read. You could go to jail or be fined if you were white and taught a black person to read. That says it all about reading. So my family took the whole thing very seriously. It was like a revolutionary act.
If you read, it gives you access to the whole world. And so, you know, nobody wants you to have that if they need you to be subjugated, you know. Interesting, actually, in the Song of Solomon, Macon Dead, who's one of the main characters in the book, he's called that because somebody makes a mistake when they're filling in forms. And he says his father's dead and he comes from Macon and they put it on the wrong line. So he ends up with this new name. It led me to think, because I've been walking around listening to her reading a copy of the Song of Solomon, it led me to think about how when you're illiterate, you can be so easily robbed of your humanity because people can take any aspect of you and write it down, take your life, change it, and you have no idea what's going on around you. It's such a disempowering thing. So, of course, they wanted to keep black people illiterate.
Morrison's schoolteacher insisted to her parents that she should go to college. So her father took on an extra job to get the money to help her get to Howard University. This was Washington, D.C. in the late 1940s, still segregated. It must have been quite a shock for her.
You know, it's the 1940s, it was America. I can't imagine that it was easy. But she's always struck me as a singularly driven individual, Toni Morrison. There's a sort of duality about her where, on the one hand, in her writing, there's such great vulnerability in her characters. But then on the other hand, there's a sort of fire
Yes.
behind them that sort
Yes.
of powers them through the most fearful, fearsome acts.
And she must have had something of that in herself.
Yes, I think
You
so.
know, the only black girl in the school ends up
Yeah.
being noticed by a teacher, sent to university,
I think
sent
so.
to Washington. Let's fast forward 20 years to the 1960s. Morrison has completed a master's degree, taught English at universities, married, become a mother. Her marriage failed, we'll hear a bit more about that later, but she had a sound academic career, and it might be then that, being in her 30s by that point, she would be thought to have plateaued. But her life changed dramatically when she landed a job at the publishing giant Random House. And here's a clip of Dana Williams, Professor of African American Literature at Howard University and President of the Toni Morrison Society, talking about the significance of that big break for her life and career.
During her tenure as an editor at Random House, there were no categories untouched by her editorship. Those that we see as the most formative in terms of what happens in the period, I think I would put in the buckets of Gail Jones, Toni K. Bambara, Muhammad Ali's The Greatest, Angela Davis, Huey P. Newton. So you see the radicalism that's happening at this mainstream house that's just very fascinating. And that she's able to do all of this as one of very few Black women in publishing in a general sense, but as the only Black woman at Random House who's able to publish the full range.
Dana was talking about the radical activist Angela Davis, Black Panther Huey Newton, and of course the boxer Muhammad Ali. In the background, in stolen moments between bringing up children and working hard at Random House, Morrison was crafting away at the novel which would go on to influence you years later across the water, The Bluest Eye, first published in 1970, including some quite disturbing scenes, as I noticed when I dipped into it. How was your experience first reading it?
I mean, you know, it's a quite dark book. There's some difficult moments for all the characters in the book, and it doesn't end well for anybody, really. But I just found that there's a kind of courage to exploring that kind of pain and exploring it without it being maudlin. It's not painful for the sake of pain. It's painful because humanity can be a painful experience.
Here she is herself talking about how it was received in America at the time, The Bluest Eye, that is. This is from the BBC archives.
Well, the Black community didn't like it because it was incest. I mean, my sister banned it. You talk about bad books. She said she wouldn't let her children read it until they were 18. And they didn't sell any copies of it. It was very low. And I got $3,000, which I spent taking my mother and my father and my children to Aruba. We had a hell of a time. You know, my mother came home, she was talking about, do you know what? They wash out your tub. They turn your bed down. None of this had ever been done for her. She was in ecstasy.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Because there's something about life-changing success. So, you know, that's her first taste of life-changing success. And the fact that her instinct was to share it immediately with her immediate family, that's a really beautiful thing. And to give her mother that experience of going to a hotel, essentially. She's talking about going to Aruba, taking her family to Aruba with her. And I can kind of relate to that kind of, you know, when you have success that changes not just your life, but the life of the people around you, that it's actually quite a hard coat to wear. And it takes a while for that to settle, I think, in a person and on a body.
We heard her say in that clip that the book didn't sell very well, but it was noticed. And after that, her novels just got bigger and bigger audiences. She started ending up on school syllabuses. Sula, 1973, Song of Solomon a few years later, Tar Baby, a play, Dreaming Emmett, and then Beloved in 1987. I reckon the civil rights movement and America's decisive turning away, not just from segregation, but from disregarding black genius, came just in time for her. Think of all the novelists and poets who never were in the black community before her.
I think she wore that quite heavily, and I think she felt that she had a responsibility to echo those voices and to give them space and airwaves, and the stories deserve to be heard, and they were heard.
And they increasingly were. Away from the public eye, she was also a friend to many people. We spoke to her close friend, the writer Fran Lebowitz, earlier this week.
Brilliant.
Let's hear what she said.
I would say that the thing that probably people would least suspect about Toni was how much fun she was. I was friends with Toni for over 40 years, so there were numerous fun times with Toni, I would have to say. She had a really, I would say, gigantic sweet tooth, and she loved desserts, and even when you were eating dinner with Toni, it was like, in a certain way, like eating dinner with a little kid, because you would be eating dinner and she'd be kind of eating her dinner and you knew she was waiting for dessert. And she also would never remember the names of restaurants, and she would say, is that the place that has the raspberry tart? That's how she identified restaurants. So she had this incredible sweet tooth. She also watched an incredible amount of television. And that was partially, or perhaps primarily, due to the fact that she believed that when you were writing, you shouldn't read. You shouldn't read anything serious. So she watched a huge amount of television and a huge amount of what any sane person would call junk. And she would be like riveted by this stuff.
Interesting. The philosopher Wittgenstein, a genius in anybody's book, apparently the thing he liked best to do was to go to cartoons in cinemas and sit in the front row and just stare at the cartoons.
Well, I guess it's a kind of, I mean, you know, these sort of huge throbbing brains,
yes,
you know. I guess it's a sort of welcome escape.
15 years into writing and 20 years into editing, she was now confident in voice and masterly in form and well recognised. Her most celebrated novel, Beloved, was by then published, a huge critical and commercial success, and it won the Pulitzer Prize and was adapted into a film starring Oprah Winfrey. Can you tell me a little about the story in Beloved?
Beloved is one of the saddest books you'd ever read in your life, in anybody's life, I think. Seth, basically, to save her children from slavery, she kills her own children because the idea that they would live this terrible, awful, brutal life is too much for her. It's almost magical realism. You go with the concept and the notion that this child would come back and inhabit the house and inhabit the heart and soul of this woman, because if you do something so terrible and so huge, how can your life possibly ever be the same ever again, and how can you possibly ever be unchanged from that?
Here she is, Morrison herself, talking about that book on a BBC archive.
The real point of Beloved was memory. You know, like generations after major terror like that, they don't talk about it. It's like coming home from a war. You can't get veterans to talk. Holocaust survivors, the first generation, never spoke of it. And took, several generations down. Same thing with enslaved people in the United States. You know, my great-great-grandfather never spoke about it. Didn't want to talk about it. You know, until you get children and grandchildren and so on. So there was this memory thing that was the most important thing for me.
Her novels were rarely set in the present. Why do you think she always wanted to go back to the past?
Well, I think actually what she was talking about there is a real hint. It gives us real clue to that, because that kind of trauma lives on in us, and if those stories aren't told, you can't transform. You can't ever let it go. It will inhabit you, and it will sort of stain the lives of you and your children and your children's children, unless you go back and you give them their stories and you give them their voice. And I think that's part of her power, is that she gives voice to the ancestors, and the ancestors need to be loved.
Yeah.
We don't know who we are unless we know
Yes.
where we've come
Yeah.
from, and we can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been.
I'd wondered about her writing routines, the nuts and bolts of an author, and we asked Fran Lebowitz.
I do know that she wrote really early in the morning. She, started writing like 5 in the morning. I, a night owl, consider that beyond quirky. I consider that kind of nuts. So by noon, Toni had done a full day's work. Toni had what very few writers have, which is a real literary imagination. So she was really inside of these people who, while she was working on it, seemed real to her. That is why when you read her books, they seemed real to you.
Fran, being a writer too, she would give her work to Toni for feedback.
For me, she asked to see things I was writing sometimes. I gave them to her. I remember her once calling and saying, "Do you want to hear what I think about this?" And I said, "No." But she told me anyway. She read something I was working on, and she said, "I think it's great, except you see here where you say you should say we, because we invites the reader in." And I said, "Well, I don't want to invite the reader in. I'm not a hostess. I'm a prosecutor. I mean you." Now, Toni really meant we. When I was a kid, my mother would say to me all the time, "Can't you be the bigger person?" And, truthfully, it turned out, no, I can't. I'm by nature the smaller person. When I really got to know Toni, I really understood what my mother meant by that, which is that Toni was the bigger person. Toni was the biggest person. She had what seemed to me to be an unending supply of empathy. Even in her characters, in her books, the characters that are, not meant to be the delightful characters, Toni always sees why. Why was a person like this? She just felt that human beings deserve that kind of attention. I myself cannot say I agree with her.
You'll know, Andy, that she was not without her critics. One famous critic at the time, Stanley Crouch, remarked in Time magazine that she would benefit from a new subject matter, the world she lives in, not this world of endless black victims. How do you respond to that?
I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Wow, Mr. Crouch. Wow, Mr. Crouch. I mean, as I've said, these are stories that need to be heard. These are lives that need to be respected. These are people who need to be loved after the brutality of their life. So for him to be so cavalier is kind of disgusting, actually. Every book is different. Every person, every character she created is vastly different to another. For him to only to be able to experience that as a swathe of people means he hasn't really read Toni Morrison's books.
We haven't really spoken much about her personal life, and we asked Fran if she could tell us a little bit more about that.
Toni lived alone the entire time I knew her. I never met the man Toni had been married to. She had these 2 kids, these 2 sons, and then he left when they were both really little. I mean, I think the younger son was a baby. She was close to her sons. Her younger son died several years ago. He died I would say 9 years ago. And she was never the same after that. That is untrue. I've known more than one person who's had a child die, and they never are the same. And that was, a terrible tragedy to her.
I think that was her son Slade.
Yes, I think he had pancreatic cancer. I think he
Yes.
died, yeah. I mean, losing a child changes you. My mother lost my brother. My brother died when he was 26, and she's never been the same. It changes you irrevocably. You find a way to carry on because that's what happens with loss. But I think that part of you that dies with them, I don't think that ever changes.
My grandmother lost her daughter and could never listen to music again after that. It just made her cry all the rest of her life.
I hear that, I see that.
Yeah. What fundamentally drove her to write? What was her mission, her purpose, do you think?
I think, actually, that empathy that Fran Lebowitz is talking about is something that runs through all of her books in the most extraordinary way. I think she felt the need to hold other people up, not just to scrutiny, but to love them and to care for them. I've always thought of her as a kind of oak tree. There's a sort of solidity
There is,
to
isn't there?
Toni
Yes.
Morrison that I find incredibly comforting. She almost absorbs the pain and the suffering from all of those